Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats. Pretty excited for this conversation. We are joined this episode by Art Markman. He is the Chief Academic Officer at the Minerva Project. Art, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, no, it is a pleasure to be here.
Art, I just am so excited to get into some of the stuff that you generously shared, some thinking out loud with a great post following your attendance at the assembly. But before we get there, you were sharing before we started recording some of your just path to the credential innovation space starts at a place that's familiar to Credential Chats viewers at University of Texas, Austin. And so maybe just a quick place to kind
Yeah.
of start is just what that looked like and how your thinking kind of started with credential innovation from where we were to where we're going.
Yeah. No, I spent almost 28 years at the University of Texas at Austin. I was a faculty member in psychology, drifted gradually into administration, and ended up as our senior vice provost for academic affairs. And in that role, at one point, I over a period of about 3 weeks, I had five conversations with five different groups on campus, each of whom was saying, we're going to start a digital badging program. And I was honestly at that point a little skeptical about badging, but I had this vision administratively of five groups doing it in five completely different ways that were incompatible with each other, hiring five different vendors and having a real mess. And so I pumped the brakes for everybody and I said, look, happy to support this, but let's actually get us all together and spend a few months talking through how we want to do this. And what that led to was actually a really wonderful engagement between continuing education and undergraduate education and graduate education. And what we ended up with was two classes of badges. We had what we called competence badges. I know how to do a thing versus completion badges. I did a thing because a lot of times continuing education programs, they just want a badge to certify that somebody went through an experience without knowing what they knew. But I think we really felt, particularly at the level of undergraduate education, that being able to measure that the student had achieved some level of competence in something was really important. And that was the place where I began to get a little bit more excited about badging, to be honest, because one of the things that I've believed about higher ed for a long time is that we should be able to talk about what students know as a result of having gone through our experiences. And yet, we rarely measure much about student learning. And that's because at the level of a 3 credit class, it's a pretty daunting task to do that. But if I have a micro-credential, so there's a particular skill I'm trying to teach, and I focus on teaching that skill, and then I assess the students and whether they've achieved competence in that, then that's not so hard to do. And once you realize, oh, that's actually how I'm supposed to be teaching in general, it maybe that feeds back on the rest of people's teaching. And so having a single system that is focused primarily on building out competence was the route that we took at UT. We did have both competence and completion, and we ended up with a single vendor, and ultimately turned that project over to the registrar, Brenda Schumann, and Natalie Murray, who was somebody who we hired for that, who did amazing work at taking an idea that was maybe 3/4 baked and turning it into an actual souffle.
Yeah, folks who are from the ACRO community will definitely be familiar with both their work and folks who've read your ACRO's report on micro-credentials from, I believe, 2021 or 22 was published. Brenda was one of the lead authors of that. You can definitely download that on the website. But before we go on, I just want to kind of slow down on two things you said there that I think kind of got my registrar spidey senses kind of activated. There's that on one hand, this is about change management and governance, was that you just saw a huge mess that we could, by being proactive, save making decisions that don't stay made and while serving our learners. And that two, that there's a way to kind of do our storytelling in our official learning records way different, way more, I guess, in depth and broader than we do, while being, kind of trusting, without, while relying on registrars as the keeper of the records to do that in trusted ways. And so could you just kind of say just a little bit more about that? Because I think both
Yeah.
those things are really intriguing.
Yeah, so for one thing, I think registrars need to step to the forefront. I think a lot of people who are uneducated in the role of the registrar at a university think, well, it's just a bunch of people in a basement somewhere keeping a bunch of records. But really, this idea of really trying to organize what the learning experience is at the university and holding on to the official record of this is what it means to have a curriculum here. This is really our record of what students have done, means stepping out proactively and beginning to say, okay, look, as we begin to modernize and adapt the curricular model, the registrar needs to play a central role in coordinating that activity. I think that's really critical. And the shift from, look, if we could re-roll the dice and get away from the Carnegie credit hour and the grade as the unit of analysis and switch ourselves to thinking, ultimately what we care about is what can our students do when they get out of the university, and not just what can they do at the very low level of, did I learn a particular specific skill about Excel or pipetting or whatever else it is that we've created a badge around, to also the broader kinds of skills, the deeper, durable skills that we think are crucial to degree programs. We should be measuring student learning. And the registrar's office should ultimately be the record keeper, not just of, I took a list of courses whose names don't mean very much and grades whose provenance is a little suspicious, but also that we are the keeper of the records of this is what students know. And if we design our courses in a way where we measure student learning, we should be tracking that, putting that at the forefront, making it available to students, making it available to faculty, making it available to the people who are designing curriculum, and using that information to help students really present themselves in the best possible way because they know what they know and they know what they don't know.
I hope I didn't distract you with my emoji reaction there. I just couldn't help myself. I think that's a first on AACRAO's Credential Chats of just I had to give the hearts there because there's so much that resonates and definitely, from organizational perspective of registrars and enrollment management perspective, it's great to hear you saying like registrars ought to be leading on some of this stuff, not because of stepping on the toes of subject matter experts, but because of how in a ecosystem, the keepers of the records can help us. The key word that I heard used there is use.
Yeah.
That we can use these records, these assertions of what learners know and are able to do, um, in ways that don't change what we've historically done with things like the Carnegie Unit and transcripts. Those still have a purpose. We have ability to do it, yes, and in these other ways.
That's right.
And would you mind just saying more about that? Like, where do you, in your mind, where's sort of the logical conclusion of what those other ways look like? And I think this kind of goes to some of your reflections that you had after the assembly.
Yeah.
But what does it look like when we say, in addition to yes, from this date to this date, they were present and successfully inhaling shortly after exhaling while getting a passing grade in courses with these titles, these other things that you're talking about,
Yeah.
when you talk about using it, what might that look like?
Yeah, so let's start with, if we thought about course designs in a little bit different, a little bit of a different way, where we were focused on really articulating these are the core learning outcomes, both at the specific level of disciplinary skills that students need to learn, as well as more deeply, these are the durable skills that are measurable, that are part of education. So a lot of times faculty members will say, well, I'm teaching critical thinking. Well, what exactly does that mean? But if you were to really break that down, and now that I'm working at Minerva Project, one of the things I love about being here is that we as a company have spent a lot of time trying to identify what those things are. So, for example, an absolutely crucial part of critical thinking is, am I trying to solve the right problem? How do I determine whether this thing that I'm looking at is the right problem? And that is a skill you learn a little bit in a biology class, and a little bit when you're taking a business class, and a little bit when you're taking a math class. I mean, every single place where you encounter any kind of problem solving, you have to ask yourself, am I actually putting my efforts against the right thing? And as you begin to realize, well, this is something that's really central to what it means to be a critical thinker, then you can begin to identify these are the various places in the curriculum where this comes up. We are going to talk about it in the same way across the curriculum. We're going to assess it so we actually can provide students with evidence that, yes, you identified the right problem here. Or, you know what? In this instance, you were a little bit, you could have done a better job of refining what you thought this problem was. And so if we got into the business of assessing that, providing students with evidence, yeah, here's how you're doing with respect to that skill at this time in your program. Now, what the students get, in addition to their transcript, is a running record of both their disciplinary skills and these more transdisciplinary skills that are the things we think are what higher education is supposed to be about. That those things now become part of a broader student record. And at the moment that you have all of that data about what students have learned, lots of things start to become easier. Students begin to understand what it is they're learning and why it is they're doing particular assignments, which is great for dealing with academic misconduct because one of the things that gets students to be willing to take shortcuts is that they don't realize why we've asked them to do things. One of the things I used to say at Texas all the time was, look, if your job is to shoot free throws in front of 19,000 people, you don't pay somebody else to do your free throw shooting practice. But we rarely explain to students how the things we've asked them to do in the classroom are the equivalent of that free throw shooting practice. If we measure student learning, it makes it easier for students to articulate what they know to prospective employers, which makes it easier for students to recognize that they've gotten a credential of value, which is something that people are spending a lot of time worrying about. At the assembly, one of the things was a major area of focus was credit mobility. Well, lots of people are spending an enormous amount of time trying to come up with systems that will create more standards around that, but we're doing it in the absence of really good data about what students have learned. The easiest way to match up courses would be to say, these two courses taught the same things or substantially the same things, and not just that the student got an A in this class, but I have evidence that they learned this set of things. Because one of the things, for example, one of the conversations that we were having was you get transfer students who come to a university, they've come from a community college, the four-year institution's faculty feel like their course is substantially different than the one a student would have taken at a community college. Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if both schools have defined what the core learning outcomes are, if the student coming from that community college can demonstrate that they have learned the stuff that is going to be taught in that class, your bias about whether that course ought to count doesn't matter as much because you've now got evidence that this student knows the things that they are supposed to know by the time that they've gotten to the end of this class. So much stuff gets easier as soon as you have learning data. But what that requires is bringing the faculty along and teaching them to think about the way they educate students in a different way, defining those learning outcomes a little bit more clearly, thinking carefully about what that assessment is so that they can provide evidence for student learning. Once you get that, a lot of things that registrars worry about become easier. And now having that record puts the registrar at the center of tremendous conversations that are happening across campus.
And there's just so much there, Art. I just said, when you were talking about, reflection, right? That's so much our high impact practices, right? From AACRAO, right? This is stuff we know that you're taking it out of just registrar, faculty in these silos, instead thinking as an ecosystem
Right.
of how we have these interconnections and interdependencies that, just like Marzano's research, we just know like one of the, speaking of high impact practice, one of the things that works is students knowing why they're doing what they're doing is a
Yep.
really great way to have successful outcomes. But I want to go, when you talk about these and maybe this is a great place for us to kind of have a last question here, Art, is you talk about these use cases of how we actually use these learning records. And, that if we know what's actually inside of a course, instead of using a grade, is that we move from using a proxy
Yeah.
that it all of a sudden the functionality, what we can do, all of a
Yeah,
sudden expands. That you gave a great example with transfer, but it just makes sense to me that when they leave our campus, whether it's for employers, a future scholarship, a 40 under 40 award, that all of
yeah.
a sudden that learning record is able to do more if they choose to use it.
That's right. And if that record becomes portable for students, now one of the things that happens is they can begin to say, well, these are the skills I'm going to need for the job that I aspire to have 5 years from now. So they've left the university, they're working, and now they begin to think about, oh, this is what's coming next for me. This is my opportunity to go back to school, maybe to take a class in a continuing education program, maybe to go back and get a master's degree. But they can do it with the knowledge that they are trying to accomplish something specific related to their future career that is going to enhance that learning record, where that learning record isn't just fictitiously a learning record, it really is a record of their learning.
I love how you answered the question and already, without even meaning to, foreshadowed and previewed a future episode on serving lifelong learners while also addressing continuing ed's CRM goals on campus. Uh, that is just beautiful. But Art Markman, he is the Chief Academic Officer at the Minerva Project. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Credential Chats.
Oh, no, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And thank you, everybody, for sharing the valuable currency of your time and engagement with you. Until next time, have a badge-worthy week, everybody. So long.